Oh,
Hope that's not something serious.
oh,
I don't know if you're talking, Rob, but you're not making any noise.
Aha, here we go. Thank you. So, the first issue that we're going to look at is issue 186, which has been around for a while, and we talked about it at the beginning of this year, when we decided that we should try and keep the model and the vocabulary quite separate, and hence keep the vocabulary at sort of community best practices level rather than actual sort of specification level. I of course hesitate to say standard. However, in certainly some discussions here locally, there has been, I would even say, some concern that as people are trying to use the data, then if the vocabularies have changed, or even the usage of the vocabulary has changed, then the data from sort of different time periods, different versions, will not be consistent, and hence implementations won't be able to be consistent. And I would say that previously we thought this was not a significant, a very significant issue, because vocabularies change very slowly and rarely, and we had expected that there would not be breaking changes in software engineering speak to vocabularies where something means one thing and then it means something else. However, in some discussion around provenance, and in particular auctions, we had interpreted the auction, sale by auction AAT concept as the lot. So auctioning of a, we had interpreted it as sale by lot. However, in discussion, it turned out that what was actually meant was the auction event as a whole. So the term that we had thought meant sale by lot was then clarified and updated in AAT to be the auction event, and a new term was added, meaning sale by lot. So it's not even just a change, which of course happens because concepts get merged or split, but that the same identifier was clarified to mean something other than what we were using it for, and a very related thing, meaning that systems that would be trying to consume the data would just completely do the wrong thing. They wouldn't even just ignore it, they would probably break. At which point, it seems like we should be a bit more rigorous in terms of defining the core, at least core vocabulary that we expect implementations to be able to understand, and put it into the documentation, into the specification directly, rather than sort of at arm's length over in a sort of best practices area. Meaning that we would then, of course, need to decide, commit essentially to some vocabulary terms, and hence some vocabularies. But that seems to me to be sort of part and parcel of what we're doing. Sign-up CRM has this useful escape hatch of P2 has typed, out from ontology to vocabulary, and an application profile such as Linked Art that then says for this particular domain, here is the terminology that we need to use. I think we need to reconsider and pick at least some basic terms that we should all use. So in particular, the 3 bullets would be any term that we need for the model. So we have this notion of primary name or primary term. So we should put that directly into the spec, those sorts of things into the spec. Any term that's pretty much just ubiquitous, like we all understand sculpture and painting, but conversely, not everyone has red figure attic vases or even more specialized than that. And then, of course, languages, materials, currencies, measurement units, and so on as the subclasses of type. I think we should also be more clear around, so feet and inches, or English, French, Spanish, Latin, Greek. Materials, I think, are going to be trickier, of course, because there's a much longer list, and similarly currencies. But maybe we can look at the data for those ones and come up with a reasonable list, even if it's not necessarily perfect. Okay, so that's the thinking, and then so what's the reaction? What people think? Is there something that we can do, or should we, or how else would we mitigate against changes in vocabularies if we're not, if we don't do something like this?
I will say that it makes me, I feel like the amount of effort that's gone into adopting AT is sort of the lingua franca of art taxonomy, along with things like iconoclast, is pretty substantial. And I'm not, I think, trying to, I've also know from being here how much work goes into the maintenance of that vocabulary system. It makes me really nervous to try to both come up with what would feel potentially like a competing standard to AAT, and also to take on the maintenance burden of vetting and dealing with terms, because I don't know that there's a consistent set of core terms. And I've watched the vocabs editors deal with this, this constant onslaught of, well, this term is really important, you should include it. The labor involved in managing that seems very high.
Right, so it's not, to clarify, it's not that we would be making new terms, it's that we would be sort of blessing terms from existing on vocabulary such as AAT. So it's reference rather than vocabulary management itself. But I hear you that having any collection of terms is work. I would argue that it's work that we have to do, however, if we want interoperability between systems.
Doing it by reference deal with your vocabulary terms changing?
I think so, in that if we say we are using this term to mean this thing, and it changes, well, we were using the term as it was at point X in time. So
right, but all of the data is still, the impact to anyone else other than in the documentation is exactly the same. We now have a bifurcation of data. If we change it, or if we don't, we're now pointing to something that is a URL that is no longer representing what we say it represents.
Yes, and I don't see any way around that, because even if we didn't, then even if we did nothing, data would still point to the two different versions for two different uses. This way, at least we know when something is of this form, it's meaning one or the other, without having to get into who is asserting that it was an option as opposed to a lot at what time, and then computing which meaning of option it was.
But if somebody uses the AAT definitions outside of linked art and they're trying to integrate, that will still be a problem.
Yes, yes, and so it's not exclusive to us for sure.
I'm just thinking, isn't the AAT vocabulary versioned? I mean, when you, I'm pretty sure that in the AAT data set, you can track back the changes of each term.
Yeah.
So when you publish the linked art version, then you can say that this corresponds to the AAT version such and such, and then people will have to work out a system to check that these terms haven't significantly changed. I mean, for generic terms that you're talking about, there won't be a much change. I mean, terms like sculpture and painting and so on.
Yes, so in AAT, there is a change log essentially within the data where you can go back and see the changes to the scope notes, the additions of new term labels, and so on and so on. And it's quite extensive. You can see pretty much exactly all of the things that have happened. The difficulty, of course, then is that you would, given the ubiquity of as type or specified as, you would need to be doing it constantly if you wanted to somehow use that information. So the way that I think about this issue is we should essentially cache those semantics and say, the linked art project will take care of looking after those things, such that when we say, if you use this in this circumstance, then it's meaning that, then say AAT then changes in a new version for linked art, we can say, okay, AAT changed, so we will update. So for version 1.1, now this term should be, you should say that this is a painting using this concept rather than the concept we used previously. Yeah, otherwise everyone has to do it, and they won't.
Hi. Are there a few slightly separate issues here? So I think what you were just describing, Rob, then is about interface stability, and essentially I agree, it's interesting to think of that in terms of caching, but what we're really saying is for this version of linked art, it's using this version of the AAT definition, and for interface stability point of view, that gets frozen at the point at which that version is declared, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So is there then a question about documentation, which came back to one of your points earlier, which is what happens if someone comes across this and does the wrong thing? Is that something that could be automated to just set a flag that says this differs from the latest AAT definition? And that's not to say, anything more than that, but to sort of set a warning just so people can see. And then it sounds to me like then what you're also saying is if there's another release of linked arts, whatever versioning point that release is, that just needs to go in the release notes that either these changes to AAT that have now made it through are basically non-consequential, but like any good release notes, that somewhere at the top for the ones that are consequential and are materially different in some bigger way, that those are flagged in release notes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yeah, some sort of update mechanism to the published versions with little warnings saying, this has changed, but and we will fix it in the next version, probably major version if it's a big breaking change. That's the intent. That's a very good way of describing what I was trying to get at.
Right. So, and is the AAT data accessible enough that could be reasonably automated from the documentation point of view?
I don't think so. We could know when a change has happened, but it could be just a typo has been corrected, or the whole concept has been rewritten. I don't think there's a way to determine which of those two cases it is.
No, but I don't think it would be that hard to, given the the list of terms we're using for as part of a release process, for someone to scan through that change log.
Yep.
And
I mean, I think that's the case for a release process, but I guess what I'm saying is also in the time when a particular release of Linked Art is active, is there a way to automatically put up a flag that one of those terms has changed in the head version of AAT, essentially?
It's worth exploring for sure.
I would also say that this might be a time for us to go and talk to the AAT people and discuss if this sort of thing, if there are practices that we can put in place on that end that might help with this. Because I think what we're trying here to do is to mitigate ontologically poor behavior. And we might be able to deal with it that way as well. I think if we could communicate that breaking changes require new identifiers, that could probably help a lot.
Yeah, for AAT, that's probably possible. For other ontologies that people might use, or that we might want to refer to, it might not be. But that would be that's a very hypothetical problem.
The other thing that occurred to me actually was specifically around you were talking about auctions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you foresee any candidate process in which the version of Linked Art is stood up to a wider audience just to check that there aren't any sort of heinous misunderstandings like that?
Yes. I think by the end of our process, over the next 18 months, we should have everything to the point where we are confident that we have done that level of due diligence. And hence, get it going on from sort of these basic core, not basic, core, basic implies simple, core concepts and core object, person, place sorts of modeling issues into provenance and exhibitions, such that we can then take the core stuff and give it its outing in October and get feedback, and then next year hopefully go even further and get other people, organizations interested, and make sure that things aren't broken, either from the modeling perspective or from the integration with vocabularies. So then part of that work definitely needs to be, we have not fundamentally messed up any of the vocabularies.
Right. So that actually means that this is relatively urgent, because essentially the proving that the selection is right comes from using it in anger and having people yell that it's wrong.
Yeah. And I guess if we don't say anything about the vocabularies, I don't know how anyone would produce records that were consistent, to the point of having any level of interoperability. If we don't say that you should use the primary term concept to tag the primary name, then how would anyone know to do that?
Right.
Great.
Oh, sorry.
No, please make your point, and then I'll jump in a second.
I was merely going to say that I think that's your first bullet point in the issue, Rob. And yeah, I mean, I don't see how that one's avoidable.
And I just wanted to jump in on the same issue and say, I mean, I think David's point is very well taken. It's apropos that we shouldn't also chase the work of creating vocabularies, and so it should just be putting some sort of fence around the things that are necessary to use the linked art model. But then I think the ones that feel doable and like they won't get out of control are these kind of drop-down list things, which are either essentially they're like drop-down lists with the primary term. That's one where we should be able to pick it out and we should be able to monitor it over versions. And the last part, which is basic languages, not materials, currencies, units, these sorts of things where they're sort of large standardized, I mean, large lists where things are changing and aren't so specialized. I'm a little bit dubious about the middle bullet point in terms of the amount of work it would throw on first conceiving of and then maintaining. In terms of what is a term that's ubiquitous in the domain and isn't too specialized.
Right. Yep. Agreed.
But otherwise, I don't know if that, I mean, if we put that sort of firewall around the level of work, does it then start to seem reasonable and appropriate?
I think that first bullet point is the most important from my perspective. And I feel like if we could say things that we define as at that level of explicit processing, we should have in our vocabulary. If we had that and a nice crosswalk, a way to describe crosswalks, so that, you know, when we say preferred, we say it's a linked art vocab / preferred, which is crosswalk to the AAT term and to any other ontology that people might be using. That feels like a useful way to do that kind of work without trying to duplicate the work of taxonomists entirely.
You were suggesting minting new identifiers for the existing concepts? Or did I misunderstand?
I think for the ones that we're using as processing instructions, that feels really useful. Things like preferred. Those feel to me like things that we should be in control of because they are so essential, which is different than I think from auction or lot or painting or sculpture, things which are terms of the art and it feels to me like it could be, there's a reasonable case where someone would want to use linked art, but want not to use AAT to describe their concept of auction, but to use something else. And I think that distinction between what is ubiquitous to the domain and what is essential for clarification of the model seems like a really good distinction between the ones that, at least in my opinion, we should be caring about and the ones that we shouldn't.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what benefit that would give us rather than just picking the existing terms, which hopefully are also used outside of linked art rather than making new identifiers.
I think it is either we trust that the terms we choose are going to be stable and trustworthy and not change out from under us, in which case a lot of this discussion seems less important, or we don't trust it, in which case I feel like we should be, if we're going to want to have that level of control, we should just assert it.
Yeah. I guess at which point, if we're going to be asserting something, then we could just assert a relationship rather than a type. If the if it's for modeling, then we could make a class or a property rather than a type. So I'm
sure, we could
convinced.
invent our own ontology as well, but I think that feels ambitious.
But isn't it kind of, isn't it fortuitous that, I mean, it's part of Getty A and part of Getty B, in as much as somewhat this conversation can be had with the AAT people, as you suggested previously, David, and see maybe it's kind of a moot point because they can avoid certain changes or certain styles of changes that would make us fearful of the potential semantic shift.
Yeah, if we could identify the terms that fall under the first bullet of, these are the ones that we really rely on, and if they change meaning, then we are really in trouble. We could identify that set and then say, please, Patricia, we are fundamentally relying on these ones. Would it be okay if they are somehow fixed in terms of their scope notes? You can add new properties, you can fix typos, but don't change their meaning, at least without giving us some fair warning. I don't know what she would say to that. I suspect she would be quite okay with it, because they very, very rarely change scopes at all.
And I think we could convince them that if they wanted to do that, they could create a new identifier and merge them, or leaving the old identifier pristine.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Yeah, and then so to George's point about the drop downs, that's also certainly something that we have seen here as being useful. That if there is, if you want to say, if you want even to do something like, give me the English name first, because I know that the user is reading, is an English native speaker, or Spanish or French or German or whatever, then knowing what language the content is in seems pretty important. Or equally, if you want to compare between centimeters and inches, then knowing what term is used for that particular measurement unit seems pretty important. So materials, there are so many of them. I could easily kick that one. I would be very happy to kick that one out. Currencies really doesn't make that much difference. It's a provenance, financial specific thing. We can certainly kick that one out. But units and languages, I think there's going to be significant issues if we don't have some degree of specification about them, or we'll be severely limiting what anyone can do other than just throw strings up on the screen.
So Rob, is there, do we presently know the things that we've thrown types on in Linked Art?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything, really.
Well, I guess, but I mean, if you saw it in pieces and what we were referring to, then we could figure out, lists definitely deserve the investment of thinking about this, and which go beyond the possibility of specifying.
There, no. Oops. There is a page which is something like the link that I was trying to type in. Community.
I just popped a link into the group chat if anyone wants to get their eyes on it too.
Sorry, vocabularies. So we have this list of things that have come up for us, at least. So the sorts of visual works, the sorts of objects, the different parts of objects, which, if you want to say that it's oil on canvas and you want to model it, then you need to know what the difference between the support and a frame, or oak frame, or recto and verso for pages. There's the options and things. This is slightly out of date. The different text types, signatures versus material statements and so on, dimension statements. Different sorts of information objects, such as a web page or a sales catalog. Different sorts of location. So if you don't know the difference between a gallery and storage, you can't display whether the object is on display. You can't put into your web page, you can't render whether it's on display or whether it's not on display. Different types of groups, such as the museum organization versus a department. That's out of date because they're types. Different sorts of activities, different sorts of identifiers, maybe less important. Names, bits of names are maybe also useful as a simple drop down. The different types of dimension, and then, yeah, the long list of materials that we've commonly run into, which can go away. But then, yeah, measurement units, and yeah, languages, and clearly not currencies on the page. But those are the ones that I have run into reasonably commonly here at the Getty, at the very least.
Would there be a process for suggesting the increase of those lists? Not that I see something now, I just foresee the...
Yes, yeah. I think these will, once we get to the point where we can start just making records, so next week for the showcase. For example, there's a lot of paintings and a lot of photographs made by and of O'Keeffe, respectively. I imagine one of the first questions that will come up will be, how do I say this is a painting and how this is a photograph? But that's then our middle term. And people could then, would hopefully be able to see from a list somewhere which is which.
Yeah, but I mean, from my experience, the next question is, how do I tell the difference between a painting and a drawing? And how do I tell the difference between a drawing and a sketch? And how do I tell the difference between a sketch and an illustration?
Right, or a vase and a red figuratic vase and a black figuratic vase and I agree completely. That's when we get into being AAT.
Right, and I mean, even with names, it's the, what's the difference between a prefix and a title? And
and it's, we need to draw a line and be pretty clear that we are not AAT. I think this also then ties into the Ethan's question about when to use types of types. Is if there is this long, potentially infinitely long list of types that we should somehow be able to recognize, then can't we just say, well, it's a coin, so it's an exchange media as a basic thing. It's a coin, which is type exchange media. It's a quinarius, which is a type of exchange media, and it's a numismatics CROIDRC 546.8, whatever that is, which I have absolutely no idea, but I imagine it's the very specific type of quinarius that this coin is. That then being able to say this is a type of X would give us that escape route reasonably quickly. So this is a for the people, this is a nationality versus this is a profession, without having to enumerate all possible nationalities and all possible professions. Then gives us the pattern to do this.
Right.
And I think, yeah, some way to, a mechanism with which to group types and a mechanism with which to cross-reference types, to do crosswalks, I think would mitigate a lot of what we're trying to solve here, outside of the things which are explicitly needed for processing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. So we have 5 minutes left. I guess the next steps then would be for 186 and 238 to go through and come up with the set of terms that we feel fall into each of the buckets, and then try to determine, is this something that is just fundamentally essential that we can't do without, such as primary term or nationality? Or is this something that, without which we are severely limiting the usability of the data, such as the difference between English and Japanese? Or is this something which could be grouped into a much larger set of things because the instances are not easily enumerable, such as red figuratic vases and impressionist 15th century paintings, which I'm sure is not a thing. And then consider for these RRC 546/8s, to what level do we need to be able to say what sort of thing that is for anyone to be able to make use of that data? Or do we even care?
When you say we there, do you mean the linked art documentation or a reference to the external documentation?
I would say I think the linked art community should be able to have a reasonable first stab at the sets of terms that we would want to then go to AAT or whoever is responsible for them and politely but very reasonably request that they not be changed because we really want to rely on their stability. And have buckets into which implementers can throw these other terms that if they change, then okay, they change, or if people use Ethan's type from numismatics.org, or they use some equivalent from a different vocabulary, yes, you would need to do a crosswalk, but it's not necessarily on us at the high level to do the crosswalk, but to enable the crosswalking, to David's point, I think.
Right, yeah.
And I would say there's, in almost every instance, there's going to be types that exist in data that will probably be incomprehensible to anyone not producing the data.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them in there.
Absolutely.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yep.
Yeah.
Alongside those points, which I think make a lot of sense, I am struggling a bit when thinking about this between what's in the documentation to explain someone how to use it and what's at a technical level something that needs to be testable essentially for interface stability. Those are clearly closely related, but I do wonder whether there's a parallel test that we can ask ourselves, which is does this vocabulary term follow the current version in the external definition, or must this term be something which is a specific version that we're fixed in within a version of linked art? And I wonder whether that teases apart some of the sort of slightly more general questions, because ultimately something somewhere will come down to that.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. yeah, and while we can't absolutely guarantee that things don't change, and we can't necessarily detect all of the changes, we can at least try to be aware of the situations in which those changes would cause difficulties.
Right. I mean, we definitely can't stop all changes everywhere. So I think being able to distinguish between those where we think it'll be plausible to live with any changes that happen by just following what the current definition is.
Yep.
That's the big distinction to, oh no, we really need to be the definition and not change.
Yep. Yeah, if AAT 300037269 Quinarius, if that changes slightly to be a particular sort of Quinarius, will Ethan be annoyed? Maybe a little. Will it be totally wrong? Hopefully not. And he's always got his internal type, which is clearly much more specific again.
Right.
And will it always be a coin? Sure. Even if coin changes very slightly, or the scope note is updated very slightly, the chances of it being wrong seems infinitely small, and chance of it not being exchange media ever seems practically impossible.
Right. And also, if that did become important to someone, then that's a versioning issue for linked art, which is in linked art in a successive version, it changes from being the default of follows the external definition to follows a specific definition. I mean, those changes could still happen. I guess it's just a question of what the default is.
Yep.
Because it seems like the only sensible default is to follow the external definition.
Yep.
And what we're really doing is selecting those where that doesn't hold.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, so for the next call, or at least before too long, I will try to come up with those lists of which types fall into which categories, or my proposal for which types fall into which categories. And we can take it from there. Right, so it is the top of the hour. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Apologies for my machine locking up completely for a little bit there. And we'll talk again in a couple of weeks.